Welcome back, everyone, to another Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the absolute most fascinating and honestly kind of misunderstood conflicts in Southeast Asian history. We're talking about Sultan Muhammad Sultan Kudarat. Now, his story usually gets told as this tale of fierce land resistance. But as we'll see today, at its very core, his reign was a literal masterclass in maritime geopolitics and coastal defense against the expanding Spanish Empire. We're going to explore exactly how the Sultanate of Maguindanao operated as this formidable maritime empire, controlling vital trade routes and using the winding rivers of Mindanao to completely outmaneuver one of the greatest naval powers of the 17th century.
Okay, let's dive into this. 50. Now, this massive number represents something truly extraordinary. When we learn about historical resistance to colonial powers, we so often just hear about single, decisive battles, right? But Sultan Kudarat successfully resisted Spanish colonial rule for over 50 years. I mean, think about that. This wasn't just some fleeting rebellion. This was half a century of sustained, strategic defense that literally prevented much of Muslim Mindanao from falling under Spanish control during his entire lifetime.
And that brings us right to the central question for today. How exactly did one sultan effectively fight off a global superpower? It's your classic David versus Goliath narrative, but with incredibly high geopolitical stakes. We're looking at a regional leader who somehow managed to completely outmaneuver the formidable Spanish Armada, a force that, let's remember, had already conquered vast territories all across the globe. So how did he pull it off?
Section 1. A fractured archipelago. Before we can really appreciate Kudarat's genius, we have to look at the board he was playing on. The Philippines, as we know it today, definitely wasn't a unified nation in the early 1600s. It was this complex web of independent kingdoms, settlements, and states. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast in power structures across the islands. You had Rajas ruling parts of Luzon and Datus governing Visayan settlements, many of which were steadily falling under Spanish control centralized out of Manila. But take a look at the south. Mindanao and Sulu were ruled by powerful, fiercely independent Muslim sultanates. The Sultanate of Maguindanao, which Kudarat led, was one of the absolute strongest states in Southeast Asia. They had a vast sphere of influence and deep trade connections to places like Borneo. Basically, they were a sovereign powerhouse. Section 2. The geopolitical choke point.
So setting the scene, by the 1630s, Spain had consolidated its grip on the northern and central islands, and they really wanted to control the southern choke points of the super-lucrative spice trade. At the same time, they wanted to neutralize the Muslim fleets. But Kudarat, he knew his true power lay not on the land, but in the winding waters of the Pulangi River. To project that power, he relied on the lanong. Now, a lanong wasn't just a boat. It was literally the lifeblood of his military strategy. These were large outrigger warships that allowed his fleets to strike swiftly across the archipelago. And because they had a relatively shallow draft, especially compared to those bulky European ships, they could just retreat safely deep into inland rivers and estuaries. These were waterways that the massive Spanish galleons simply couldn't navigate. It was a brilliant setup.
And this brilliantly illustrates the asymmetrical warfare dynamics at play here. On paper, sure, the Spanish Empire had overwhelming firepower. But in practice, well, they were dragged down by heavy galleons, incredibly long supply lines, and honestly, their environment. In fact, tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery actually wiped out far more Spanish soldiers than open combat ever did. They just didn't know the rivers. Kudarat, on the flip side, leveraged these swift vessels, intimate local knowledge, deep intelligence networks, and absolutely devastating river ambushes. He outright refused to fight the Spanish in open field battles. Instead, he forced them into a guerrilla war on the water that they were completely ill-equipped to fight.
Section 3. The fall and retreat.
Of course, dodging the Spanish war machine forever was pretty much impossible. Eventually, a seemingly impossible crisis struck the Sultanate when Spain launched a massive amphibious assault. Let's move to and see how this builds across a very tight, violent window in history. Kudarat ascended to power around 1619, and he focused really heavily on uniting the maritime tribes. But look at 1637, the fall of Ilocos. Now this is followed rapidly by a counteroffensive in 1639, culminating in a peace treaty by 1645. But to really grasp the eventual victory, we have to look closely at the absolute devastation that happened in 1637.
The 1637 blockade was basically the ultimate all-is-lost moment. Spanish Governor-General Corcuera coordinated this massive fleet that actually successfully blockaded the river mouth. This effectively cut Maguindanao off from the open sea and, crucially, their Dutch trade partners. Corcuera's forces breached the river defenses, overwhelmed Kudarat's coastal forts with heavy artillery, and captured his capital, Ilijan. During all this chaos, Kudarat himself was severely wounded. I mean, to the Spanish forces and really to the rest of the world, it looked like the maritime resistance of Mindanao had been permanently broken.
But here's the thing. Kudarat did not surrender. Instead, he executed a breathtakingly brilliant tactical withdrawal. First, he retreated deep into the interior, intentionally drawing the Spanish forces far, far away from their naval supply lines. Second, from the safety of the highlands, he waged a relentless war of attrition, just bleeding the Spanish logistics dry. And third, and this is perhaps the most important part, he went to work diplomatically. He reached out to the rival datases of Sulu, Lanao, and Mindanao. He gave them a stark warning. If they didn't stand together right then and there, the Spanish fleets would isolate and conquer every single one of them, one by one.
Section 4. Reclaiming the Seas.
Well, that diplomatic gamble paid off beautifully, and by 1639, Kudarat was ready to take the water back. The 1639 counteroffensive was an absolute masterstroke of maritime guerrilla warfare. Kudarat launched rapid, highly coordinated riverine and coastal attacks using his shallow draft vessels. They completely decimated the isolated Spanish garrisons that had been left behind to hold the territory. By constantly harassing Spanish supply lines, he rendered their massive, heavily armed galleons completely ineffective in those narrow straits and twisting riverways. The Spanish quickly realized they were trapped in an unwinnable situation. They couldn't hold the inland territory, and they definitely couldn't secure the coastal waters.
Section 5. An enduring legacy. By 1645, the Spanish were literally forced to the negotiating table. The resulting peace treaty recognized Kudarat's sovereignty, finally ending the attempt to conquer his maritime empire by force. But the broader impact of his half-century reign echoes far beyond just a single treaty. It's really about the preservation of identity, religion, and sovereignty for an entire region. So the crucial point is captured perfectly in a famous speech Kudarat reportedly delivered to neighboring leaders who were actually considering submitting to Spanish rule. He warned them, saying, "Freedom, once surrendered, is difficult to regain." He anchored his entire conflict to this singular, powerful idea. He refused to let his people become servants to foreign rulers, and he successfully convinced a fractured region that independence was something worth fighting for, together.
When we step back and summarize exactly why the Spanish Empire could not defeat him, it really comes down to 5 main pillars. Unity. He brought historical rivals together for a common cause. Geography. He essentially made the rivers, forests, and mountains fight for him. Naval skill. He completely mastered riverine and coastal guerrilla warfare, completely neutralizing Spain's massive technological advantage. Diplomacy. He didn't just fight. He negotiated and formed really strategic coalitions. And finally, leadership. He had immense political and religious legitimacy, and he inspired deep, deep loyalty through actual, tangible success on the battlefield.
As a direct result of these pillars, Sultan Kudarat ruled until 1671, living to the truly extraordinary age of nearly 90 years old. He wasn't just a warrior who died young on the battlefield, He was a statesman who actually lived to see the fruits of his labor. Because of his strategic brilliance, Spain failed to conquer his kingdom, and he ensured that large parts of Mindanao retained their political autonomy and Islamic institutions for generations to come. That's a massive legacy.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We so often picture historical resistance as these pitched battles on open fields with swords and muskets, right? But how does understanding the use of maritime geography, shallow rivers, and the really difficult diplomatic work of forging unity change the way we view historical resistance against global empires? It wasn't just about bravery, it was about brilliant, highly adaptive strategy. I highly encourage you to look deeper into the history of the Maguindanao Sultanate. There is so much more to uncover. Thanks for exploring this explainer with me, and keep learning.